histology of gastrointestinal tract or digestive system. The parts of the gastrointestinal tract are tubular in shape except the mouth or oral cavity and stomach. The basic tissue layers present within the parts or organs of gastrointestinal tract are from outermost to innermost, the external, the blue color here, the external layer called serosa, which is simple squamous epithelium. Beneath it directly connective tissue, mostly fibrous connective tissue called adventitia. Muscularis, arranged in two layers, outer and inner, or musculosa. Submucosa, connective tissue, mostly loose connective tissue, and the innermost layer called mucosa, related to mucous membrane. Since most of the epithelium, which is the inner lining tissue covering the internal cavity or surface of gastrointestinal tract organs or parts, composed of three layers: the inner layer epithelium, the second thin layer of connective tissue called corium or lamina propria, mostly loose connective tissue, and the third layer muscularis mucosa, thin layer of muscular tissue. Thus, any part or organ of the gastrointestinal tract or digestive system internally composed of four basic tissue layers in arrangement from outermost to innermost: serosa or adventitia, musculosa or muscularis, submucosa, and the innermost layer, mucosa. The internal parts of the gastrointestinal tract: esophagus, stomach, small intestine, the initial part of small intestine, the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, colon or large intestine, the sigmoidal region, and the rectum, ended with the anus. In histology, we will begin with the elongated internal organ of the gastrointestinal tract, which is the esophagus. Thus, the histological layers of esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine are the most important in this chapter. The basic histological layers, as I said, arrangement here from innermost to outermost. ترتيب الطبقات النسيجية من الداخل للخارج. Mucosa related to mucous membrane because epithelial tissue is rich with mucus secreting cells forming a mucous membrane. The mucosa composed of 3 tissue layers: the inner epithelium, beneath epithelium, thin layer of connective tissue called lamina propria or corium, and the outer layer of the mucosa, thin layer of muscular tissue called muscularis mucosa. The second basic tissue or histological layer, submucosa. It is connective tissue, mainly loose connective tissue, having the basic structural features of connective tissue, highly vascular, rich with blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerve endings, in addition to clusters or a group of nerve bodies called plexus. These plexus located in the submucosa called submucosal plex or plex of Mesner, which is a cluster or a group of nerve cells. The third basic tissue layer or histological layer, muscular tissue, called muscularis or musculosa, mainly composed of 2 layers, rich with the blood vessels, nerves, as well as cluster or groups of nerve cells, called also plaques or plexus, since it is located or present in the muscular tissue or muscularis, called mentoric plex or a plex of air patch. The last tissue layer, serosa or adventitia. Serosa related to serous membrane of the peritoneal cavity, composed of simple squamous epithelium. If there is no serosa, beneath the serosa, which is epithelium or epithelial tissue, a layer of connective tissue called adventitia. Thus, if the outermost layer is connective tissue called adventitia, if the connective tissue or adventitia covered by external layer, which is thin layer of epithelium, only 1 layer called serosa, composed of simple squamous epithelium, and the serosa, as I said, related to the inner membrane of the serous membrane that line the peritoneal cavity, which is the visceral membrane, and mainly composed of simple squamous epithelium. This figure illustrates the layers the basic tissue layers, the inner layer, mucosa, composed of 3 tissue layers, epithelium, lamina propria or corium, muscularis mucosa. Beneath it directly, submucosa, which is connective tissue, rich with blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves, and a cluster of neuron or nerve bodies or cells called submucosal plaques or plaques of Meissner. The third basic tissue layer here, the muscularis, composed mainly of 2 layers, inner and outer. Mostly the inner layer of muscular tissue, arranged circular, the outer layer arranged longitudinal, and the external sheath here or tissue layer is serosa. Serosa means the outer layer is epithelium composed of simple squamous epithelium, beneath it directly connective tissue. If there is no epithelium, then the outermost layer composed only of connective tissue and called adventitia. Histology of the mucosa, which is the innermost layer that lines the internal lumen of gastrointestinal parts or organs, type of organs, and the specific type of epithelium. Oral cavity or mouth, sac-like structure, lines by non-keratinized stratified squamous. The pharynx, short tubular structure, lines by non-keratinized stratified squamous. Esophagus, elongated tubular shaped structure, lines by non-keratinized stratified squamous. The stomach, sac-like, lines by simple columnar epithelium. As well, all the parts of small intestine and large intestine or colon, lines or covered by simple columnar epithelium, rich with goblet cell or cells. The last part of the gastrointestinal tract, the anus, lines by non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Folds, which is an extension or a projection, or even you can call it a processes, but more correctly here to call it projection, since it is a fold emerged out of the cell surface of epithelium within the mucosa. Esophagus, none, no folds within the internal lumen or surface of the epithelium. Stomach, they have folds or extensions or a projection emerged from the internal surface of the simple columnar epithelium called ragi, which is the tough surface of the internal lumen, and gastric pits, the parts of small intestine, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, mostly have villi, crypts, fascia circularis, and the brush border, which is the microvilli. Large intestine, mostly having posterior structure, but the most important here is the intestinal gland. Histological structures or features of the submucosa: esophagus, characterized by esophageal gland, which is a mucus secreting gland, multicellular, actinous in shape, thus called esophageal glands. Stomach, there is no specialized structure within the submucosa of the stomach parts. It is normal connective tissue having the basic structural features of any connective tissue. The duodenum, the submucosa, contain a specific structure called duodenal gland or Brunner's gland, which is multicellular. The cells alveolar or actinous in shape. Brunner gland secrete mucus or a mucin, and it is a specific structure within the submucosa of duodenum. Ileum contains cluster or aggregates of lymphocytes called Peyer's patches or Peyer patches, which is lymphoid nodule, تجمعات clusters من الخلايا الليمفاوية. Large intestine, any part of the large intestine, the submucosa, it's normal connective tissue. No specialized structure within the large intestine, submucosa of the large intestine. Histological features of the muscularis or musculosa: esophagus, composed of 2 layers. These layers are arranged in circular and longitudinal. Mostly the inner are circular in arrangement, and the outers are layers are longitudinal in arrangement. Stomach have 3 layers of muscular tissue or muscularis, circular, longitudinal in arrangements, as well opaque, the 3rd pattern or layer of muscularis. Small intestine, large intestine, like esophagus, composed of 2 layers, and both have circular, which is the inner, and the outer is longitudinal in arrangement. Serosa, the outermost layer, as I said, serosa related to the serous membrane that line the abdominal or peritoneal cavity. And the serous membrane composed of 2 layers. It's a double membrane. The outer, called parietal, that encloses the abdominal wall. The inner, called visceral membrane. Serosa is the visceral membrane that cover or line the organs within the abdominal or peritoneal cavity. Esophagus having serosa, no serous membrane or visceral membrane, no simple squamous epithelium, only connective tissue. Thus, the outermost layer, called adventitia. Since esophagus located back to the trachea within the thoracic cavity and emerged inferiorly until directly linked with the cardiac region of the stomach, particularly linked with the junction, which is called esophageal gastric junction. Stomach lined by serosa, the external tissue layer called serosa, and serosa is the visceral membrane or visceral peritoneum, composed, as I said, of simple squamous epithelium, as well the parts of small intestine and the parts of large intestine. Anus, the outer tissue layer, is adventitia like esophagus, no serosa, no simple squamous epithelium. Esophagus, the tissue layers of esophagus, arranged from innermost to outermost. Mucosa, this is the lumen. Mucosa, epithelium, corium, lamina propria, muscularis mucosa, submucosa rich with glands, esophageal glands, muscularis, and outermost layer adventitia. Thus, mucosa, type of epithelium stratified squamous, non-keratinized. Submucosa contains esophageal gland, which is multicellular mucus secreting gland or glands, acinous or alveolar in shape. Since the submucosa is composed of connective tissue, which is loose connective tissue, as I said before, having the basic structural features or characteristics of connective tissue, particularly blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves, in addition to the Meissner plexus. Muscularis or musculosa, the type of muscle fiber in the esophagus, which is an elongated tube, differ. The first third, which is the upper third or upper 1/3, composed of striated skeletal muscle fiber. The middle mixed skeletal and smooth. The last third, which is the inferior or lower third, mainly composed of smooth muscle fiber. And in any third, muscularis or muscular tissue arranged in 2 layers, circular and longitudinal. The outermost layer, adventitia, mainly loose connective tissue. Which type of loose? Areolar connective tissue. No serosa. Histological slide revealing the tissue layers of esophagus, cross-section, stratified squamous epithelium, lamina propria or corium, muscularis mucosa, submucosa, esophageal glands, muscularis, 2 layers, inner layer and outer layer, adventitia. This section was taken from the upper third, thus the type of muscular tissue, striated skeletal muscle. Cross-section of esophagus revealing thick epithelium, non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, lamina propria, muscularis mucosa, submucosa, and musculosa. Stratified squamous epithelium, non-keratinized, lamina propria, muscularis mucosa, submucosa, esophageal gland, which is multicellular acinus or alveolar in shape, mucus secreting, and tunica muscularis, which is arranged into 2 layers, circular and longitudinal. Lamina propria again, and muscle bundles of muscularis mucosa, the 3rd layer of mucosa. This figure illustrates the difference between the lumen and the tissue layers of esophagus and the trachea. Esophagus is the internal real organ or part of the gastrointestinal tract, as well the trachea is the internal real organ, elongated in structure, elongated cylindrical or tubular in shape of the respiratory system. The basic function of esophagus is food passage, while the trachea air passage. The basic differences in tissue layers related to the type of epithelium. Trachea, as you know, composed of ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, while esophagus composed of thick, non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The lumen of a trachea typically wide due to the presence of hyaline cartilage at the anterior surface. The lumen of esophagus is elongated since it is tubular, haven't any cartilage at the esophageal wall. stomach, the shape of stomach, sac-like structure, anatomically composed of different regions, the junction between esophagus and the stomach, called esophageal gastric or stomach junction, the first part of the stomach, very close to the heart, called cardiac region or cardia, the fundus or fundic region that is rich with glands, the body, the narrow end of the stomach, pylorus region or pyloric, having a sphincter directly linked at specific junction with the first part of small intestine, which is the duodenum. The basic structural features: mucosa composed of simple columnar epithelium and having gastric beds. The stomach divided into 3 tissue or histological regions on the basis of the nature of their glands in the epithelium or the mucosa tissue layers. The first called cardiac region, second fundic region or fundus, and the third pyloric region. The junction between esophagus and the stomach, the pyloric region, the fundus, the body, again please, the junction between esophagus and the stomach, the cardia region, cardia because this segment or part of the stomach is very close to the heart, the fundic region or fundus, the body from here until here, and the concentric last region of the stomach, which is narrow, called pyloric or pylorus region, contain a sphincter, which is valves composed of circular arranged smooth muscle, play a role in pushing the food from stomach to the duodenum. The basic structural feature of a stomach is muscularis tissue layer, mainly stomach composed of 3 muscle tissue layers, longitudinal in arrangement, circular and opaque, thus having thick muscularis. The other parts related to external anatomical structure of a stomach. The same figure illustrating the basic regions or parts of a stomach related to histology: cardiac region, fundus, and pylorus. Body contains normal tissue layers. Cross section at the junction between esophagus and stomach. This is the junction, المنطقة البينية, the attachment point between the last part of esophagus and the initial part of stomach. At this junction, there are structural modifications at the level of tissue layers. The type of epithelium in a mucosa of esophagus stratifies squamous, while in a stomach, simple columnar composed of one layer, here stratified, very thick. Thus, at the junction, the epithelium of esophagus become to be structurally modified or changed gradually until reaching one layer, and further change in the cell shape to be transformed into columnar. Lamina propria, which is thin layer of connective tissue, areolar or loose connective tissue in esophagus, become much thicker in the stomach because the stomach glands are impregnated within both lamina propria as well the submucosa, while the submucosa of esophagus contains only esophageal glands. At the junction, structural modification occurs for the transformation from cluster multi-esophageal glands into unicellular glands. This region represents the fundic region of the stomach, containing more than one types of unicellular glands, like parietal cell that secrete hydrochloric acid, mucous neck cell, zymogenic or Chief cell or peptic cell that secrete pepsin. The third layer, muscularis, composed of two layers. At the junction, transformation or structural modification occurs for the synthesis of third muscular tissue layer, thus the stomach having three tissue layers, thick muscularis, comparing to esophagus. The last layer, adventitia in esophagus, at the junction here, addition of another tissue layer, which is simple squamous epithelium, to form what is known by serosa. In this slide, it is not clear. The cardiac region of stomach, the arrowhead indicate gastric pits. And these are the gastric glands within the cardia. C means cardia or cardiac region glands. Mucosa, composed of simple columnar epithelium. As you know, the basic structural feature ovoid nucleus or nuclei located very close to the basal surface, in addition to mucus secreting glands these glands called cardiac glands, multicellular, acinous, located only in lamina propria. No cardiac gland in submucosa. This is very important information. The submucosa, normal connective tissue, loose connective tissue. Musculosa, inner circular and outer longitudinal. The cardia, since it is the initial part directly located beneath the junction, is still composing of two layers. The outermost layer, serosa, simple squamous epithelium covering the connective tissue. The fundus or fundic region, all these are the glandular part that is impregnated within the lamina propria, as well the initial part of submucosa. The type of epithelium in mucosa, simple columnar, presence of gastric glands, these glands mostly impregnated in the lamina propria, and the initial part of submucosa, but mostly present within the lamina propria or chorea. Cross-section of the fundus or fundic region of the stomach reveal the cover, the internal cover that lines the internal surface, simple columnar epithelium with ovoid nucleus, very close to the basal surface. Corium or lamina propria, which is normal connective tissue, thus rich with the blood vessels. Simple columnar epithelium is a glandular epithelium. Have structurally modified columnar cells that are transformed or converted into secretory cells, acting as a gland. These cells are impregnated or mostly present in the lamina propria. Different unicellular glands present in the fundus or fundic region. The most prominent one here, the red color, is the parietal cells. Secrete HCl or hydrochloric acid. Large cell, pyramidal in shape, not circular. This is typical shape, having large round centrally located nucleus. A mucus neck cell, secrete mucin. The Chief cell or peptic cell or zymogen cell, secrete pepsin, structurally modified, having columnar to cup-shaped، يعني شكلها بين المكعب والعمودي. columnar to cup-shaped cell, large round nucleus, close to the basal surface. schematic diagram of the epithelium that line the lumen or the internal surface of the fundic region. The base represents the secretory part or the glandular part that is present within the lamina propria, different cells, mucus cell, as well as mucus cell located at the surface, axonitic cell, which is the parietal cell, Chef cell or peptic cell or zymogen cell, enteroendocrine cell, secrete hormone, the isthmus, and the gastric bits. These are anatomical terms. From isthmus to the external cover that have the pits, all represent normal columnar cell shape. Cells of the fundic region, mucous neck cells, parietal or axonitic cells, Chef or cold peptic zymogen, enteroendocrine, in addition to cluster of undifferentiated cells. This is the parietal or axonitic cell, pyramidal in shape, large, have large round centrally located nucleus, parietal or axonitic. These are mucous neck cells. The blue color here represents the peptic or Chef cell that secrete pepsin. Schematic diagram representing the glandular part that is impregnated or present within the lamina propria and the types of unicellular glands. The parietal cells, pyramidal in shape, also called axonitic cells, having large round nucleus. The peptic cell or Chef cell, in shape very close to the cup shaped between columnar to cuboidal, having round nucleus close to the basal surface. The large cell here, parietal, and the cup-shaped or very close to the cup-shaped are the Chef cell or the peptic cell. I'll stop here and continue next lecture.